Welcome everyone to the second of 3 lectures held at the Hale House with our theme of temperance and prohibition. My name's Heather. I am with the Hale House, and I am thrilled for this collaboration with the Steamship Historical Society tonight. Astrid Drew will be speaking on rum-running, trade in Rhode Island, and how that war on the water took place. Astrid is the archivist at the Steamship Historical Society. She has a master's from Simmons in library and information science, and she specializes in archives and preservation. She has worked with the Steamship Historical Society for quite a few years and has built up a tremendous amount of knowledge on the history of steamships, which she's going to share tonight. In her spare time, she actually also is a writer, researcher, and also a grassroots organization organizer for the Providence Poetry Slam. She's also, I hear, a fantastic soccer player, and I don't know how she fits in all that time. Before I turn it over to Astrid, I'd like to explain a little bit about the Hale House for those of you who don't have the opportunity to join us there. On the next slide, you'll see that the Hale House was built in 1873. It was built by Charles Maxon at the request of William Whedon. He built the house intentionally to give it to the Hale family to reside during the summer while they had the opportunity to spend time together in a beautiful setting. The Steer family owned the property after the Whedons sold it, but it was then purchased by Ken Woodcock, who with his team lovingly preserved it. And by 2007, it was listed on the National Register of Historic Places, much in part from the work by Joan Yunkin, the project director. When it was donated to the South Kingstown Land Trust in 2015, we offer tours of the historic site Wednesdays from 1 to 4 during the summer up to Labor Day. Why might you actually want to come to the historic Hale House? Well, we've had quite a few notable residents. Edward Everett Hale, he was the U.S. Senate chaplain between 1903 to 1909. He is the relative of Nathan Hale, the American Revolution patriot, but he was also a man of papers, graduating from Harvard, Unitarian minister, and well known throughout the circle for his work as an author and even artist. He has 2 children that were significant contributors to the American Impressionism movement in Matunic, Rhode Island, Boston, and America. Helen Day Hale, also known as Nellie, and Philip Leslie Hale were those artists. And believe it or not, even Marlon Brando stayed at the Hale House while he was in the theater at the Theater by the Sea. With that, I'd like to transition to our next slide that talks about the fact that we are going to turn this over to the Steamship Historical Society, who we want to thank so much for the collaboration and the chance to work with you. This meeting is recorded and will be available later on the Steamship Historical site, sshsa.org. If you have questions, please put them in the chat and I'll work with Astrid to get the answers. Astrid, it's all you.
Great. Thank you so much, Heather. Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me?
Hear you great.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for that introduction. Yep, this slide is just to, hopefully it'll cooperate. There we go. That's our website at sshsa.org. Please feel free to visit us online. We're on all of the social medias, and you can also come in person, though we're a small staff, so we just ask that you call ahead so that we can make sure that we can give you a proper tour. Yeah, and with that, I'm just going to get right into it. So this was a very fascinating topic, and I did not really realize the historical context. So the next few slides are just to kind of set the stage for that, for how Prohibition came into being. The temperance movement actually began in the early 1800s. As these groups kind of became more formalized with actual membership roles, they published newspapers and even formed political parties. The first one was the Union Temperance Society of Moreau and Northumberland. That's New York State, actually, not England. And they were formed in 1808. They didn't really have so much staying power because their whole messaging was about moderation rather than complete abolition of drinking and alcohol. So apparently that wasn't enough. So these later groups, the American Temperance Society was founded in 1826. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was founded in 1875, and the Anti-Saloon League was founded in 1893. These are only just a few of many societies like them that were around and active in the period. I bring up especially the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League, because they were by far the most influential. The Anti-Saloon League in particular was the driver behind what became the 18th Amendment. With the Women's Christian Temperance Union, they could be extremely militant, where they would actually go into bars and smash things up, bringing a hatchet and like smashing mirrors and bottles and just making a ruckus. All of their argumentation was really about, it was heavily into religious aspects of morality and, just being, a good person in that way, because in their mind, alcohol led to all kinds of dissolution of the mind, body, and spirit, as illustrated in this lithograph, in this slide, to try and illustrate the sort of continuum, the drunkard's progress as it is. And a lot of their messaging was about the effects of alcohol on the family and faith and children as well. But later groups, especially the Anti-Saloon League, used a different sort of tactic in their messaging, where you see much more of the sort of messaging in the cartoon on one side, where company owners for breweries and also owners of bars and saloons or taverns were portrayed as these villains, or in this particular case, as a sort of robber baron, basically a corporate fat cat who are trying to steal money from the regular people. So you have this sort of dual messaging where basically think of the children, think of your families, and trying to hit on the emotional chord of that, while also trying to highlight the financial aspects of it as well. It's like, you don't want to give all of your money to these people, that don't need it. They don't need your money. On the other side, we have a darker aspect, which is nativism. The messaging was less about domestic violence and abuse, gambling and criminality that they said that drunkenness or alcohol could lead to, but also stressing on this sort of foreign aspect of drinking practices. In this time, you had immigrant groups. In this particular cartoon, the Irish and German groups are focused on. And in the cartoon, you have people fighting in the background, all this political conflict, whereas these groups are shown as basically stealing the message and stealing people's votes. So a sort of xenophobic turn that these groups were using to underscore their arguments. And I think it's interesting to me because I come from a family, I'm half Swedish. So a lot of our celebrations, smorgasbords and holiday dinners involve drinking. And it's not to the point of, getting completely wasted, as it were, but, it's just part of the meal. You're singing songs and you take a little drink and you continue eating and socializing with your neighbor. It was very much part of the culture. But this sort of underscores the fact that a lot of these groups were driven in large part by Protestant people. And that's the sort of basis of the religious mindset that these people were coming from. And I think also particularly is why many people in Rhode Island, especially, were suspicious of this messaging. It's important to remember that in Rhode Island, we have the largest population of Catholics in the country, and that has been a fact for a while. Well, I'm not sure if it's currently true, but it has been for a very long time. So you can imagine the Irish Catholics and Italian Catholics and these other folks being very suspicious of this kinds of messaging. But all of that comes to pass in 1919 with the Volstead Act being passed and going into effect in 1920. And this is the principal verbiage of the bill, or the amendment rather. And I included this map because I just think it's really illustrative. The states in black are those that ratified the amendment, but those in white are those that did not. And if you look up into the itty bitty corner of New England, right next to Connecticut, there's that little white speck of Rhode Island. That's us. We did not ratify the amendment. And I was very surprised to learn that Prohibition, as it were, of outlawing alcohol had actually been attempted several times before in Rhode Island history. The first time was around 1852 for the so-called Maine Law. And it was called that because it was modeled off of legislation out of Maine. That lasted for about 11 years. And then the next time lasted for much shorter, about 4 years, passed through a constitutional amendment passed in 1886. And in the top image is actually a snippet from a newspaper in Rhode Island, the Evening Tribune, which was published in June 1889. And part of it reads, "Rhode Island tried prohibition in the Constitution, almost immediately found it a humbug, and has now cast it out. The deepest and thickest of all soups simmers above the dries." As a writer, I just really appreciated that line. It's really fun. The dries was a colloquial term or, slang term for people who were prohibitionists, basically, who supported the prohibition of alcohol. So that kind of illustrates in part some of the sort of, context that brings us to 1920, and probably part of why Rhode Island was not so enthused about the 18th Amendment. And as an extra note, yes, we never ratified it, and we were third in line to ratify its repeal in 1933. So I love this image. This is a woman who has refitted her cane to include a hidden flask, which she is using to spice up her drink there. But the rather large quote, I apologize for the block of text, but that quote is from a interview with a man named Ron Deaver, which is possibly a fake name, who he claimed he was a bootlegger back in the day. And this was from an interview published in Old Rhode Island magazine in December of 1991. And what I appreciate about this interview is that it illustrated a lot of things about this period, especially in Rhode Island. It was a time period where people were struggling to find jobs and hold on to their jobs. Nobody was making a lot of money. So this was an attractive prospect to get into bootlegging. And another aspect of this quote is that it seems like it was very easy. This man seemed to just be like a regular guy who was waiting tables, and he found this connection, this quote unquote old man Giles, who would give him some alcohol to sell on the sly while he was waiting tables. And if I did the math right, basically this means if he was making 35 cents on every half pint and he sold all 6 half pints that he was trying to sell perhaps in a week, that means he had an extra $2.10 in his pocket every week. That may not sound like a whole lot, but according to the inflation calculator that I used, that is equivalent to about $40 today. And I suspect that it had even more buying power back in the day, because I mean, some of you may be thinking, oh, $40 really can't take you that far today. But I think it had a measurable impact where, you know, and he says he was able to get the price up. So it was an attractive thing and relatively easy to get into. This other quote is from the same interview. He notes that he bought a new car, a 31 Ford Coupe, new clothes, and he was having a good time. So that kind of illustrates how profitable this sort of business could really be. And another aspect that I wanted to point out with this quote is that he said, unfortunately, Giles didn't want any more partners. So after much negotiation, Giles ended up missing and I ended up with no job. So what this illustrates is how quickly organized crime kind of took on this business and did a lot of consolidating with these quote unquote negotiations, where they would essentially either eliminate business or they would link up with other people, and became very powerful and in controlling the liquor market. And with this pull quote, he's talking about the sort of ships that you would see in international waters. He describes it as 7-mile limit, but that's actually not true. At first, it was 3 miles offshore was the limit for international waters. But by 1924, the U.S. government had arranged for that limit to be extended to 12 miles, all in an effort to make it that much more difficult for bootleggers to bring in their wares. So what he's essentially describing in this pull quote is what was called rum row, which was these supply ships that would bring liquor and hang out, you know, in international waters, basically just out of reach of the Coast Guard or the authorities, so that they couldn't be arrested. But these smaller ships, which were often called contact boats, the Coast Guard nicknamed them blacks, probably because they were frequently they were sailing without lights to try and conceal themselves. But how the interviewee, Mr. Deaver, describes these boats is actually pretty accurate. A lot of them were very brazen with how they were advertising the liquor that they had on board, with flags and placards showing what kind of booze they had and for how much. And there were so many of them that, I read multiple accounts where it seemed like just a very large number of ships just kind of hanging out all in one area. So I think it was probably accurate to where he said, got to where there were so many ships out there, it looked like we were being invaded. So the next few slides are just to illustrate the kinds of vessels that you could have seen out on Rum Row. They included large recreational craft like yachts, either sailing yachts or steam yachts, and as well as fishing sloops or schooners. And these vessels, as well as larger vessels like cargo ships, would have been transporting liquor from Europe and then into ports in either Canada or the Bahamas. And these sorts of vessels would load up either in either of those places and then go to various spots in international waters to create these rum rows, all up and down the eastern seaboard. And in many cases, this kind of traffic would revolutionize, in a way, a manner of speaking, it would turn these towns, especially in the Bahamas, into boom towns, essentially. I read one description where in the Bahamas, at first they were bringing in 50,000 quarts in 1917, which was about what they needed for the average population in that time. By 1922, they were bringing in 50 million quarts of liquor. And that was to accommodate this illegal traffic where, gangsters and syndicates would send their ships in to load up and wheel and deal and then bring it back up for sale. And they were, this is another example of a ship that you may have seen on Rum Row, these sort of ocean-going cargo vessels. And also coastwise cargo and passenger ships like this one. The James Whitney is what is portrayed here, though as far as I know, she wasn't involved in the trade. But I chose it because I thought it was a illustrative example of what it may have looked like. Note the small vessel in the foreground there. A lot of the contact boats, the ones that were going from Rum Row and transporting liquor to shore, were these smaller, very fast boats. And they would bring them in our case in Rhode Island, they would bring them in into the bay, and eventually this liquor would end up in local speakeasies. A very famous one included the Biltmore Hotel, and also some other speakeasies like Twin Oaks allegedly was a speakeasy at first, before the proprietors were busted in the 30s, just before Prohibition was repealed. And then, Twin Oaks, as we know it today, was born. But another spot was also the General Stanton Inn. And some of the principal names that you would encounter when looking into this topic, there was one man named Carl Redditch, who owned a house on Warwick Neck, right on the water, probably for obvious reasons, which was nicknamed the Crime Palace. He operated a lot of his illegal doings out of this house, and undoubtedly included bootlegging. And some of those contact boats would have looked like this. They were very sleek and very fast. Note the number on the hull in this picture, though. This is actually a vessel that's owned by the Coast Guard, at least by the time she was photographed here. So that shows how the Coast Guard was taking over these vessels as well, and using them for their own purposes to fight bootlegging. So at first, the U.S. Coast Guard wasn't heavily involved. It was local police enforcement, police and squads who were kind of left to this task. But the Coast Guard couldn't help but notice this accumulation of vessels in what they became known as Rum Row in international waters. So eventually, they had to beef up their fleet. In 1923, the Coast Guard Commandant, William Reynolds, he requested government support in the form of 20 new high seas cutters, 200 coastal patrol cutters, 90 fast picket boats, $20 million in supplemental funding for this fleet, and 3,500 additional personnel to crew them all. Ultimately, $13 million was approved, but nonetheless, that was the largest increase in Coast Guard history. So the larger vessels were these destroyers. Shown here is the USS Cunningham. She was formerly a Tucker-class destroyer, DD-58. She was built in 1915 by Cramp & Sons in Philly for the U.S. Navy. She was refitted for this kind of service and began her service for that purpose in 1925. So though these kinds of vessels were definitely faster and more maneuverable than other naval vessels, they were still no match for these smaller, fast speedboats that were going back and forth between shore and Rum Row, which is why the Coast Guard employed these vessels, which were called 75-footers or 6-bitters. These were the kinds of vessels that were frequently seen chasing and firing on rum-runners. And these vessels, note the numbers. If you were going into research for yourself this topic, this presentation I'm giving is really just touching on some of the hot topics of it. So if you want to look into it deeper, you'll encounter accounts with these kinds of Coast Guard vessels. They all have 3-digit numbers like this. So you encounter these kinds of descriptions. This is the kind of boat that you are dealing with in these altercations in Coast Guard records or in stories that you may read. And they were wood-hulled with a top speed of 15 knots. And you'll note that they have a gun on the forward deck there. And they entered service between 1924 and 25. This is just a sort of examples of the many kinds of vessels that the Coast Guard employed of different kinds of speeds. But even so, the top speed, at least that I could find, was 20 knots that the Coast Guard vessels could reach. But a lot of these smaller power boats were much faster, up to 30 knots. And I'll talk about how they did that in just a minute. But some of the tricks and tactics that rum runners would use were, good old fashioned money talks, right? So they were bribing officers to either look the other way when they were transporting their cargo into ports, or to actually communicate with them any Coast Guard movements so that rum runners could avoid them. They would also set off fake distress signals. At this time, the Coast Guard was still doing their usual service of safety, of search and rescue. So if they got a distress signal, they had to respond to it. So that was one method that people would use to try and get the Coast Guard, the authorities, off their case. I mentioned vessels sailing without lights. This was in blatant violation of the rules of the road. And something to note too is that to combat this, Coast Guard vessels would likewise often go sailing without their lights, so to try and conceal themselves from their prey. So it's interesting to note that authorities were breaking their own rules in their effort to catch the lawbreakers. So it just, it's kind of a mess. But other things that rum runners would use, fog could be an ally in this way, being able to obscure their movements. But they also used smoke screens by pouring liquids on their diesel engines, and that would create a smoke screen in which they could make quick turns or otherwise get out of way. The Coast Guard used searchlights to try and keep a spotlight on these rum runners in the water. So smoke screens helped them to kind of diffract the light so that they could make a speedy exit. Another thing that they would do is they would just dump their liquor. So sometimes if they were able to get close to shore, they would actually dump it in coves or on beaches. That always wasn't ideal, though, for obvious reasons, right? Because any sort of local who saw you doing that could come and raid your stash. So there was always that sort of risk with that tactic. But another tactic that they did was specially packing the bottles in these manila folders. So that's how they were described. I'm not entirely clear on how that enabled them to float, but they would float essentially just under the surface of the water, so that at night, it was difficult to see. But if you made a note of where you were when you dumped them, you could come back in broad daylight and you would be able to find them. So that was one way that rum runners would essentially stash their liquor and then go back and retrieve it. I mentioned them using smoke screens for quick maneuvers, especially with these larger destroyers, these refitted destroyers. If they could get far enough ahead from them, a rum runner or a contact boat could make a quick turnabout and speed right by them. And of course, the destroyer had to, it was a much more drawn out process to turn around a ship like that. So sometimes just a quick maneuver like that was enough to enable them to get away. To get away from these smaller vessels, like the 75 footers, what contact boats or rum runner boats could do was sail over shoals or sandbars or these very shallow regions where, especially in the shallower waters of the bay, where still these Coast Guard vessels could not follow. They also use secret codes and languages and radio communications to communicate with each other without interference from the Coast Guard. And of course, everybody, thinks of mafiosos in this time period with the Tommy gun and machine guns and stuff. And that was definitely happening as well. They were all armed with various kinds of revolvers or rifles. And they would use that to either damage or destroy the searchlight, injure officers that were on board vessels, either operating the searchlight or the vessels themselves, and otherwise just try to make a nuisance and deter being pursued. Another aspect that I read about that was very interesting was the shipbuilding. So there were a lot of these small boatyards that were active in this period. The Knox shipyard was one that built the infamous Black Duck, which I will tell you about very shortly. A man named Walter McGinnis operated out of there, and he designed these very fast boats, as well as the American Boatyard is another one in East Greenwich that was mentioned. And but I'm sure there were many others of these small boats, small boatyards or shipyards that were building these vessels, both for the U.S. Coast Guard and also for the smugglers. In many cases, I can imagine it must have been very easy for a smuggler to kind of kick some extra cash to people working these shipyards or these designers, and say, hey, for some extra money, give me some intel on what the Coast Guard is doing. So, and by the same token, the Coast Guard was capturing these boats, which gave them insight on how the smugglers were operating, how they were designing their vessels. So it definitely seemed like there was a lot of communication back and forth of them copying each other in an effort to outwit or outmaneuver each other. The vessel in this picture, though I think it's a Coast Guard boat, I suspect it may be one that was captured, because in one of the sources that I read from a Coast Guard colonel, he described an innovation that the smugglers created with their power boats, and it sounded exactly like the boat pictured here, where the pilot house had a sort of pillbox construction around it to protect them. And also the vessel, the hull design itself had a sharp chine, which refers to the sort of point in the hull. And you can kind of see that in this image where the boat appears to be cutting through the water. So, that sort of design made these boats especially quick and able to move fast through the water. And to also enable them to do that, they were outfitted with airplane engines. They were essentially V-12 engines that were surplus from airplanes from World War I. So they would outfit these little boats with as many as 3 or 4 of these engines. And in one case, the Coast Guard tested one of these boats that had 4 engines, and they loaded this boat with 32 tons of sandbags to kind of simulate a full load of liquor. And even with that full load, the boat was able to exceed 30 knots. So I can't imagine how difficult it must have been to handle if they couldn't have been going at top speed without a full load. But it was nonetheless, for the time, extremely powerful little boats that were being built. And the other innovations that they used were all these, sort of hiding places that they created. In this image, this actually probably isn't the cleverest option, but it's from a passenger ship where all of these bottles were stowed underneath the mattress in a stateroom. But they used all kinds of hidden hatchways and false floors and all kinds of things like that. In one case, they would have hidden hatchways that would be triggered by a pin in a wall. And if you're just an officer who climbs on board and is looking around, it may look extremely innocent. It may just look like a nail in the wall to hang a hat or hang your coat. But in reality, when you pull that out, then all of these hidden doors kind of flop down, and there are these hidden hatchways for some illegal cargo. And some of the false floors I mentioned, this is a sketch of how some of these fishing schooners or sloops would have been built to conceal extra cargo room for liquor. And so you can see that they have a false keel and a false floor to conceal a lower compartment. And this wasn't, before the Coast Guard caught on to this, it wasn't obvious. They would climb on, look around, oh, nothing here, and away they went. But eventually they were able to catch on, and what they would do is essentially compare the vessel to its documentation. So if the vessel had, a certain measurement or weight, and then they were able to measure it during a search, they could tell that something was kind of, didn't line up, didn't sync up because of either the extra weight that the liquor would accumulate on board, or just the measurements being off by these sorts of concealments. So I'm going to share some juicy stories now. The Black Duck was one infamous vessel, a fast smuggling boat allegedly owned by the man I mentioned before, named Carl Redditch. In December 1929, she was spotted carrying 383 sacks of liquor. It's described as sacks because at first liquor was packed into boxes, but then they were packed differently so that they were easier to handle and took up less space. So that's what they mean by sacks. She was spotted in the early hours, around 2 a.m. on a foggy morning in 1929. The Coast Guard sounded their horn. They turned on their spotlight and made a signal that they wanted to board and search, but the order was ignored. So the Black Duck kept going, and the Coast Guard would later say that they gave a warning shot across the bow, which they were required to do by law. But in this case, it's most likely that they did not do that. But nonetheless, the smugglers on board in this case, unfortunately, were hit with rifle fire from the Coast Guard, and 3 of them ended up dying due to their wounds. The survivor was the captain of the vessel. He was only 23 years old at the time. And this case in particular caused a lot of upset with locals. It was actually, though there was always action happening, chases underway and rifle fire back and forth between the Coast Guard and these vessels, it seemed like the death toll was relatively low. So the fact that three young men died at once in this kind of instance was very played up. And I think it was definitely latched onto by opponents of Prohibition, especially to kind of make their case that this was sort of only causing more trouble than it's worth. The law was causing more trouble. So though charges were attempted to be brought to the Coast Guard officers involved, they were cleared, which of course didn't help things in terms of local feelings toward the authorities and sentiments towards smuggling as well. Rhode Island was and is sort of famous for our contrarianism, right? And our legacy of bootlegging goes, and sort of smuggling in general, goes very far back, all the way to colonial days when we were, outwitting and running from the British as well. So this only fueled that sort of local lore and fervor or mindset, in terms of our opposition to these laws. And here's a map from the National Archives to try and illustrate how exactly it happened. It may be kind of difficult for you to see, but according to the course of events, basically, the Coast Guard claimed they gave a warning, which they probably didn't. Suddenly, the Black Duck swerved just as an order was given to fire shots, some extra warning shots, but instead those shots hit the boat and unfortunately hit men on board as well. So it caused a whole kerfuffle, but you can see sort of the beam of light and sort of the limited conditions that both of them actually were operating within. So because this happened in the early hours of the morning in darkness, in fog. So a very confusing, dangerous sort of situation, even without violence of gunfire. Here's another sketch kind of illustrating the bullet holes and damage to the Black Duck. Another very infamous boat that I want to touch on. There are so many. Another one was called the Alibi 2, and there are so many other vessel names that I came across in my research. So these are just two examples of many that were active at the same time. The Mauna Lola in particular, though, was extremely fast, and she was famous for 3 principal chases. She was spotted in February 1930. She was chased up the bay. She would eventually be caught in Fall River, but everything was gone. There was no cargo aboard. The crew was gone, and even the registration papers were gone. So without any evidence, they kind of had to turn her back over to her owners, and she was off scot-free. And I included, this is just a map from Google Maps, but it's kind of to show the sort of environs that the Coast Guard and rum runners would have been involved in. Rum Row probably would have been a little bit further off of Block Island, but I've read it being described as between Block Island and Montauk. So this was the kind of area that contact boats were going back and forth in, and where the Coast Guard was prowling. I also read of interesting articles published at the time in the 1920s describing Block Island as basically like a den of thieves, basically, in that they were all in cahoots with bootleggers, and which is fun to think about. I'm not sure how true it is, but you got to admit that they would have been very well situated, very close to Rum Row. It would have been a very good spot to be if you were a bootlegger. But the Mauna Lola, in any case, she was described in all kinds of chases up and down the bay. The next chase happened the next year in 1931, where shots were fired. She was zigging and zagging to avoid it, and eventually she escaped. And she was found empty, like the previous year, off of Prudence Island. And in that case, shots were heard off of Middletown, and people actually could see the chase from the cliff walk in Newport by the firing of the guns. They could see those lights going off in the dark. So it must have been a pretty dramatic scene. And the next time was the following year in January. She was chased, but this time she was captured. She was carrying between 400 and 500 cases of liquor. She was found to be registered to a man named Harry Bennett, but at a Providence address. But when they went to the address, there was, of course, no Harry Bennett who lived there. And the crew who were captured as well all gave false names. But it's suspected that the Mauna Lola, may have been connected to the Irish gangster Danny Walsh, who was a very wealthy gangster. He had a horse farm and mansion in Charlestown, and also 2 very big houses in Providence. So yes, this was very big business and very profitable business for the big names in this. But if you look at this map, you can really see how where this traffic was going. Between the mouth of Narragansett Bay up and down to Fall River and Providence. So you can see how locals would have been kind of upset with this sort of traffic that could get pretty close to home. And so part of the purpose of what I hope to find out more was how this affected local shipping, but I couldn't really find many details. if I have some more time to dig further into it, maybe I can dig up some more interesting stories. But it may be that by this time, a lot of local traffic was kind of giving way to the automobile. A lot more people were driving rather than taking steamships. And also by the Great Depression, a lot of these local companies were going out of business. So it may be that this kind of traffic just didn't affect any night boats that may have been still in operation. And obviously, because it was largely happening at night, it wasn't affecting any daytime traffic. But nonetheless, a lot of local people would point to these particular stories, the Mauna Lola and the Black Duck, as evidence of how troublesome this law was, in that it was actively killing people, and through the efforts of enforcement, but also some of the downstream effects of the law. Everybody has heard of bathtub gin. So people were making their own liquor out of really subpar or liquor that just was not meant for human consumption, and getting very sick off of it and even dying. And also this liquor that was being smuggled in, it's also important to note that up to 75% was what I read. Up to 75% of that supply that was coming in was adulterated. And by that, I mean it was either cut or otherwise diluted with water or this, nasty alcohol derivatives, extracts and things to try and mask the taste. So that was definitely affecting people's health. And part of these cases that were brought forth to argue against the continuation of prohibition. But all of that actually is an interesting sidebar. I believe Heather will be giving a presentation on that subject of bootlegging in general, of how liquor was produced and how a lot of our favorite cocktails came to be. So I encourage you to check out that talk. I know I'm going to try and tune in. But yeah, I have no idea how I'm doing on time, so I hope I didn't go too over. But that is more or less what I have. I would love to take questions if people have them. Let me know.
Yeah, it's a great time for questions. First of all, thank you. That was amazing. Wonderful examples, and a lot of stuff I didn't know. So we'll open it up to the floor. If you have questions, feel free to go ahead and unmute yourself. If for any reason you're unable to speak with a microphone because of your technology, you can also note it in the chat. So fire away. What questions do you have?
I've got one. Great job, Astrid, by the way.
Thank you.
Did you come across any reference to decoy boats being used to lure away the authorities from some of the rum-running boats?
Yes, that was definitely used. I mentioned distress calls. So that was a tactic as well, where they would have a vessel that would, be quote unquote in distress, and send the Coast Guard off running. Another method of decoy that they did was actually essentially the decoy was essentially a bait boat where they would have some liquor on board, and then make a big show out of, coming away from a supply boat or a mothership on Rum Row, and sort of, lead them on a wild goose chase while these other contact boats could slip away. And and as I said, a lot of this was happening at night. So, and the Coast Guard vessels only had one searchlight. So if they were trained on one, they couldn't necessarily see others that were nearby. So that's how those decoys were used. Yeah, excellent question.
Other questions from the audience? I was curious, Astrid, about the use of wireless technology for the radio. And I was wondering if the New England wireless tower that used to be in Point Judith, if maybe that was involved in any types of communication to avoid the Coast Guard. Don't remember what time period that radio tower was.
I'm sorry. Which radio tower? Can you rephrase
So
that?
on the property of the New England Wireless and Steam Museum, there is a tower that was the radio wireless tower. And that actually was moved from Point Judith to the museum. And I'm curious if that was ever used. I wonder either to communicate secretly or to dissuade the Coast Guard from finding out where they were.
That's a very, very good question. I wonder if our friends there would have more information about that.
Yeah.
But I feel like when it was in use, though, it probably was for, official purposes.
Yeah.
So if anything, it may have been used by the Coast Guard rather than smugglers, but
Sure.
But who knows? I mean, really anything is possible. These it seems like these smugglers could get very clever with how they utilize technology at the time. So it's a possibility for sure.
Awesome. Well, if we don't have any other questions, I'll go ahead and do a close first. Thank you, Astrid. Amazing research and always interesting. So I really appreciate that.
Sure.
If you could share that last slide.
Oh, yeah.
I wanted to let you know that we've had a great season. The first presentation was done by Dr. Pope Mellish, who spoke about colonial rum making. And then, of course, we had the War on Water today with Astrid. And our last talk will be next Wednesday at 5:30. And it's Banished Demon Rum, where I'll be talking about temperance and prohibition movements in Rhode Island and talking a little bit more what Astrid was illustrating, that there were two laws well before 1920 was passed by the 18th Amendment. And then finally, we do have our last plein air art night, and that will be the last Wednesday of August at 4:00. We'll be focused on watercolors once again, and that's been extremely well attended at the Hale House. For those of you who are not in Rhode Island, thank you so much for attending. And if you do have the chance to come down to Matunic, please let me know, and we'd be happy to give you a tour. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. Appreciate it.